We hear a lot about boundaries, how setting them is an important part of self-care, how respecting the boundaries of others is a key to good relationships. But there's also a lot of information, online especially, that may be a little dated or misleading. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. My guest today has thought a lot about boundaries, how to set them, what they really are, and why they're needed. Her new book is called The Boundaried Therapist, Sustaining Yourself in the Counseling Profession. And it's a guide for psychologists and other professional therapists to set appropriate boundaries with the clients they serve. And I thought a lot of the principles outlined in the book could be helpful for the rest of us as well.
I'm Nicole Perry. I'm a registered psychologist in Alberta, and I recently wrote a book on boundaries.
And your book is about boundaries for clinicians, for the most part, right? Psychologists. But I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about boundaries more generally today. But first, what was the genesis of the book? Was boundaries something you were finding yourself having a hard time setting in your own practice? What made you think this is the book that I want to write and that people need?
It's a long journey, this book, actually, and it really did start from my work with clients when I was a young clinician. So, 15 years ago, being in my early 20s, and sort of seeing them struggle with the same things that I was struggling with personally. And for me, that began in relationships, sort of this curiosity of like, why is it that even though I know what I want to need in relationship, I'm ending up in these situations where, how could I say, like, it's not reciprocal, it's not meeting my needs, it's not really what I want, and knowing all that, but having a hard time extracting myself. So a lot of my clients were kind of experiencing that same thing, and that's what got me started in the world of boundaries. Now, since then, I've explored all over, and I've become more critical of kind of the early works that I read, because a lot of those early works were focused more on codependency. They were taking a pathological type of view of if you struggle with people pleasing, if you're a giver, that there's something wrong with that and we need to fix it. Whereas now I've really shifted away from that. And I also found that some of those early books read more like instruction manuals for assertive communication, which also fell flat for a lot of the young clients that I had who really cared about their professions and their communities and, the people that they were entwined with. And it wasn't so simple as just saying no to them.
Right. And I think that a lot of what I read online about boundaries and what you see on TikTok and on Instagram and people talking about setting boundaries, a lot of that is about sort of controlling the behavior of others, I think. And you write in your book that that's not what it should be about at all, that it really is about, and you use the phrase, I think, that it's about getting to your own yes, right? What you want to be able to do for yourself. And I'm wondering if you could explain that a little bit more. Why, what you're talking about is your own behaviors and your own interests and your own needs.
Yeah, that's it. And so what I can say to start is part of my own journey was creating my own definition of what boundaries were. Because like you, I felt it was a lot of sort of rules-based, other people-based, and so at some point I came up with this definition that boundaries are the external expression of our internal limits. Right. So meaning if you kind of tune into your body, heart, and mind and notice, I'm really anxious about this upcoming presentation I've never presented before, or, something that I've learned in training but never actually tried in a real life situation. Being able to honor that, and instead of just pushing through and saying, oh, I should be able to do this, or, why am I making such a big deal? That maybe a boundary is I ask for help. Right? Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sort of the mind and the body, and you talk about that at one point in the book where you're talking about how your mind and your heart and your body are three separate things that might react three different ways to a situation where, a boundary might be helpful. And I found that very interesting because I never really thought of it that way, where I think I live in my mind. I think, okay, yes, I can do this, therefore I probably should, and that sort of thing. And you're saying, no, you got to listen to all parts of the body to figure out where you want to be.
Yeah, yeah. Like, and in that example of that I just gave about preparing for a presentation, the head might say something like, well, no need to be anxious. Like, you're prepared, you know what you're talking about. People want to hear what you have to say, like all this sort of encouraging wisdom. And yet there still may be a twist in the gut or this sort of fluttered feeling that people are dealing with. And so, because in our culture we prioritize that listening to ration and reason so much, in my work I emphasize, well, let's also listen to what's happening on other levels. And sometimes that twist in the gut is about, this is important to me. Sometimes it's about, I'm actually not ready, or I don't want to do this. But we only know that by listening in. And the other example I just thought of it again was, again, imagine listening into yourself, realizing I'm exhausted. And the boundary that shows up could look very different depending on the person. It might be, I need to take a break. I need to take a couple days off. I need to find something rejuvenating, right? So really, as you listen to your whole self, figuring out what you need that will match all parts of you.
Now, is that what we would call mindfulness? Listening to your whole self, being present in your own mind and body? Or is that something a little different?
I think it's really rooted in mindfulness because it also takes the non-judgmental approach. So it starts with that, like, listening in and listening deeply, being willing to ask good questions rather than just press on. And then whatever comes to us, even if it is an I'm not ready, that we try our best to honor that.
And you mentioned that, our society does sort of value this idea of overriding everything else, right? Intellectual stimulation and that sort of thing. And another thing you write about that we valued for a long time is this idea of work for the sake of work, of being the person who works the hardest and all that. And it struck me, for years, 17 years, I was in radio. And in 17 years, I took one sick day. And I was very proud of that at the time. And I look back on it now and I think, what was wrong with me? Why on earth? Why was I proud of that? That doesn't make any sense, right? Had I been thinking about it in a more holistic way at the time, I'm sure that I would have approached things differently from the beginning.
Yeah. And I'm laughing because I can absolutely relate. Like, we had the awards for perfect attendance, and I was so mad when I didn't get it because I had dentist appointments that had to be during the day as a teenager, right? I was like, that's not fair. I'm looking back, it really wasn't. It's like, you're rewarded for going to school when you're sick, never having any medical issues. And as you saw in the book, over the last 10 years for me has been quite the journey with migraine disease. And so I really feel like I flipped from a be there at all costs, kind of productivity over health mentality, to one that recognizes I need to have that time. I've really oriented my life more around my health than around my work as the time has gone by.
And that makes sense to me. And I imagine that if there's a significant health issue, something like migraine disease, that pushing through that only makes it worse rather than taking the time, right? That you can't just say, okay, well, I've got a terrible headache, but I'm going to keep going. And then tomorrow I'll have finished the task that I set for myself and things will be better. I imagine tomorrow ends up being a little worse as a result.
Yeah, it sets in. And, even as much as I was trying not to do that, I would catch myself trying to make it to the end of the day. And it resulted in then me having to call my partner to come pick me up from work. And this was about a half an hour drive because I couldn't drive. I basically, last client left and I laid on the couch with an ice pack on and my eyes closed and, waited for him to arrive with medication and a way back. And then that office became somewhere I didn't really want to return back to because it, was connected with this terrible time. Now I'm much more likely to say to clients, hey, I feel a migraine attack coming on. I'm going to take something and cancel so that we can connect later. And I try to leave space in my schedule so that I can have that flexibility and move it around. Like I say, kind of orienting my life to the fact that I do live with this and I'm going to need more space and time.
I imagine there's a lot of crossover with what we imagine to be self-care. And there's a lot of talk about self-care now and work-life balance and that sort of thing. And you say in the book that boundaries are self-care, but you also say that boundaries require support from those around you. Like you say, your partner comes to your work and picks you up when need be. And I have always sort of thought of self-care as something that you do take care of yourself that doesn't involve a whole lot of other people. So I'm wondering if you can just explain that to me a little bit, how, boundaries setting and self-care are in a sense synonymous, but there's a little more to both of them.
Yeah. Yeah, like in some ways, some of the easiest place to start when we are working on boundaries is with ourselves. Like, what do I need? First of all, just like the mindfulness of understanding what my needs are, what my values are, what's important to me. But then once we know, there may be some things we can do for ourselves and other things we're asking for within a workplace setting or our communities. So some of the examples in the book have to do with, I've worked with a lot of supervisees where they've had certain needs, like a scent-free office, or something I always ask for is lamp lighting instead of overhead, because that can be a real trigger. And these aren't things that I can just do on my own. So it can be difficult in a workplace because we're vulnerable. If we ask for something, it's always possible that workplace can say no. And yet going forward with the idea of like, that is a need for me. I'm allowed to have needs. I'm allowed to ask for my needs can be really powerful for a lot of folks.
For sure. And I think a lot of this we think of as happening in the workplace, more so than even in our own homes, because we do talk about work-life balance, because self-care means taking some time for myself. I work from home. And yes, I'm going to have that 40-minute nap in the afternoon in the middle of the workday and then work a little later in the evening. And, I'm going to balance that out for myself.
Yeah.
But I feel like the same principles basically apply to the work situation and to your own personal life, interacting with friends and family.
Yeah, boundaries can show up in all these areas. And I'm going to try to tie this all back into that question you had earlier about boundaries not being rules for other people. So one need that I have at work, whether I'm working from my home office, which I am now, or working from my clinic, is, quiet, uninterrupted time, right? And an example of how I would try to put that on other people might be, hey, family, please be quiet when I'm working. Like, don't come in, and sort of explain to them why it's important, which obviously my partner gets, my child's still learning. Try to remind them about it and all this. But for myself, at some point, I realized I could put a lock on the door. And I did. And I do the same at my workplace because although it's unlikely at this point that my child will come in or the maintenance person will show up, it has happened. It is possible. And so thinking about for myself, what do I need for my nervous system to stay regulated is the assurance that I won't be suddenly interrupted and there's another person in my session. So I lock the door. And so, yeah, it kind of shows up in multiple areas. I see the same for people where they're kind of looking for that, uninterrupted time at home as well, even outside of their work hours, and realizing that, I can actually turn off my notifications on my phone or my computer so that I'm not interrupted. It's like, there's more I can do to set my boundaries than I realize.
I get it. Whenever I'm about to record a conversation with someone like the one I'm having with you now, I make sure that no one's doing laundry or that the washing machine isn't going and that sort of thing. I'm in my home office too. But the one person in my house who has no concept of boundaries is my tiny little dog, who will at some point make an appearance and bark like crazy during the. Just be prepared for that. There's nothing I can do about it. He does not understand.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good example because we all do trade-offs, right? Like I have a dog too. He may make noise, but I found like what can I make peace with? I could take my computer to the office where there aren't any pets and da 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 da, but the internet isn't as good there, isn't as reliable. And so I've kind of just made peace with the idea of that once in a while I'm going to be interrupted and tried to model with the people that I'm working with that like that's okay to go take a second to take care of what you need so that you can be present here. Right. Where other colleagues are like, no way, I can't work when my family's home. Like they either need to go to daycare or I need to be in the office. And it's sort of that listening to what actually works for me. Where can I make compromises that fit for everyone versus times when I make compromises that are at a detriment to myself? And that probably changes over time too. You know, what worked 5 years ago is going to be different than what works today.
Yeah, and you say in your book that it's obviously very different for every person. They approach it differently, and knowing what your limits are is something that each person has to figure out on their own. And one of the things you said that I found to be quite profound is that pushing through our needs is pushing our own experiences down, which I thought was quite an interesting way to look at it, which I hadn't thought about before, right? That if I need to take a bathroom break, I need to have a snack because I'm hungry and it's the middle of the afternoon. And I don't do that so that I can get some of the work done, so that I can keep focusing on the task at hand. Then all I'm really doing is making it worse for myself until I finally, fulfill the need that I have. You also go into some great detail about what happens if you skip too many bathroom breaks and that sort of thing, which I don't think we need to go into detail on here. It's just bad for you medically. I'll let people know that. But
yeah, that's it. And that, like, I noticed that in my sessions, even where people will come in, oh, sorry, I'm late. Like, I just woke up, haven't eaten anything. I'm like, do you want a snack? And sometimes the quickest answer is an automatic one. No, no, I'm fine. But I started to realize, like, that's part of how our culture raises us is to, I don't want to make myself a problem. My needs aren't a big deal. Let's just push through. And so I've really made a practice of like, well, let's see if we did have a snack, how that might feel. Similar to, I've got blinds in the office. Sometimes the sun strikes you in the eye. No, no, I'm fine. People will say, okay, what would happen if we tried to put the blinds down? Okay, now let's try to put them up. Like, and actually taking the time to let that land in their body. How is it for me when we take the time to meet my needs, even though I could just push through, even when it's not that big of a deal, right?
yeah. And I think that, what you're saying about sort of the societal pressure to say, well, my needs aren't as important. I don't want to be a bother. Don't go out of your way for me. Like getting up and putting the blinds down would be an effort for you. So I don't want you to have to go through all of that.
All that trouble.
Because I can't see anything, right? Like that seems like it seems self-evident. But I would also say that, a lot of the things that I see online, the advice people give when it comes to setting boundaries and that sort of thing, is almost the opposite, where no, my needs are going to be the only thing that matters.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it seems to be setting a boundary such that you never have to feel discomfort. I'm going to tell you what my boundaries are, and therefore you're never going to mention anything that upsets me. You're never going to challenge me in any way. And that's how we're going to live. And it has to be a middle ground in there somewhere, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a little bit what I was trying to get at before with when I was talking about that pathologizing approach to boundaries is the antidote that we were given years ago, and maybe like you say even now, was, well, just only care about yourself. And I think that's swinging from one side of the pendulum to the other. It's something that can happen as people are starting to work with their boundaries, is they've been so used to putting everyone else first that they're like, okay, finally me. But, usually we're aiming to find more of that middle space that says, like, how can I put my needs on the table and also hear, what's important with the relationships that I have in my life that I want to maintain, so that it's not your needs are more important than mine are more important than yours, but to say, hey, this is all important. And maybe if we put it on the table together, we can find something that works good enough for everyone.
And you talk a lot about relationships in your book. You talk about the psychologist and the client as having a relationship. And when you say, let's talk it through, put everything on the table and figure out the balance, is that something that you do as a psychologist, both of you coming to an arrangement where a boundary is defined, or does that sort of move over time as well? And is it different for a psychologist and a patient than it would be for, say, a husband and a wife, or a girlfriend and a girlfriend?
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, that's a thinker. Because certainly, as you say that, there are things I wouldn't compromise on at work. Like, I've come to learn that evenings are not great times for my brain from the migraine perspective. So I don't work evenings. My clients are great. They're like, girl, take care of your body. Like everyone, because I model that and because I'm, encouraging them to be compassionate, when I take the time to be compassionate to my needs by saying, sorry, I need to run out and go to the bathroom before, let's pause our session, or no, I actually don't work evenings. And so we'll need to find a daytime time to connect. Most people are getting that. So yeah, all that to say, there are some things that aren't compromises for me, where other things like, how are we going to work on this together and how often? And this intervention that I'm offering, I think that's a very feminist approach to say, here's what I'm coming in with, here's what you're coming in with. Let's see if we can collaborate on a pathway together.
And you talk about feminism a lot through the book and having a feminist lens on this. In addition to what you just said, how does feminism apply here? What is the feminist lens of setting boundaries that might be different from a different lens?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things I could say would be the focus on the body. Whereas traditionally coming from more of that like focus on reason, might be more of a little an older approach. And especially when people are coming in, they haven't often given space to focus on their body. They felt their bodies are unreasonable, so they sort of take that strategy of cutting off from them. So I would say that would be one piece. Another part of a feminist approach kind of says, you may have been given a lot of messages from out there in the world about productivity over health, politeness over safety, others over you. Listening to now what's actually important to you, right? Rather than taking just what's important in our society. And there's an important cultural context to that too. Like many of our BIPOC clients don't resonate with the idea of hyper independence. And so what might work well for them in a family setting might look a lot more close and interdependent than someone growing like myself, growing up white, kind of Western approach. So I think it's that flexibility. Say, what really makes sense for you, not what I think from my identities, from my upbringing, from my values of what I think a good boundary should be, but helping the client listen in deeply to, given their beliefs, their family values, their cultural context, their availability to actually set those boundaries, what works for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes great sense. And you have a great example in the book of a psychologist, a Black psychologist, who's saying, it's not the same for me because I do see my clients outside of work. I see them at church and I see them at the events that we do, cultural events. And it's because I've seen them there that they then trust me to be a psychologist for them. And so it's a different type of boundary, different type of relationship, different sort of approach than, maybe a Midwestern white psychologist might have, right?
Yeah, and being aware of those biases. And by biases, I don't mean like good or bad, but just, yeah, like what are sort of the experiences and identities I'm coming in with? And am I pathologizing a client who might want or need something different than what I would want or need?
I was thinking about that too. And I've spoken to many psychologists who work in very rural, remote communities up north for the most part, maybe in Newfoundland or northern Alberta or northern Manitoba. And they were saying that it you have no choice but to engage with your clients in a different way because it's such a small community. It's not like you're only going to see them for an hour every Tuesday or whatever, right? You're going to see them at the grocery store. They're going to be the person who works at the gas station when you go there. They're going to be your kid's teacher in school. So I wonder if that changes the dynamic of trying to set boundaries when they're constantly being challenged, I imagine.
Yeah. It makes more and more sense when we talk about that individualized approach of what works for me in this context I'm currently in at this time in my life.
Because I imagine that for them, it's, and, some of them will say it's kind of like when you see a doctor on TV and a comedy and everybody finds out he's a doctor. So they start asking about all their medical ailments immediately, right? Then you kind of can't escape from that when you're out in a crowd with people that you know, because that's the whole time, right?
Yeah. And that's why it's always so great to turn into the person themselves who has to set the boundaries. Like, what's their experience? What's their wisdom? What's actually going to work for them? Last thing I'll say on this note of, you brought up the kind of ethical boundaries, right? I think that was something I noticed is when I look back now on the training I had, years and years in the human services, even before I started my training as a psychologist, no one ever talked to me about my own boundaries. There was ethics about, clients between yourself, ethics of you and the relationship with your clients and not crossing their boundaries, not doing unethical things, but no talk about vicarious trauma. How do we do this in a way that's sustainable? So I'm aiming to change the conversation, or let's say add to the conversation a bit and make sure that, our needs as humans also matter. We are humans first, therapists second, as I say in the book. And that's important to listen to.
And I think that there's another layer to that ethical boundary in psychology now, which is social media. Your client tries to follow you on social media. What do you do, right? And so we have a significant ethics report detailing, what's ethical and what isn't. But I don't know how much about your own personal boundaries we actually have in there. Now, you mentioned vicarious trauma. That's something I wanted to talk to you about because it's a term I've heard before. Is it something that is sort of unique to psychologists? You hear about a client who's gone through a terrible experience, and then you absorb some of that experience yourself in talking to them about it, and you experience vicarious trauma. Or is that something that can happen to any of us when we're talking a friend through a situation?
Yeah, you got it with the second part, that we say the biggest risk for vicarious trauma is the amount of exposure you have to trauma. And so, our helping professionals are more at risk, EMS, medicine, social workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyone who's exposed to a traumatic event can develop it, which I hope is also depathologizing to remember that, it's not personal factors that are the biggest risk. It's the amount and level of exposure, and if you felt supported afterward or through it.
Kind of like concussions in football. It's the repeated hits to the head that lead to terrible outcomes more so than the one big hit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned EMS. If I'm an ambulance driver and I show up to the scene of a terrible accident, and that's traumatizing and that happens over and over, is that vicarious trauma, or is that like trauma because I'm showing up to it and seeing it, just to define the term, I guess?
Yes, I'll think about the definition in a sec. But interestingly, from a somatic experiencing perspective, the way that we were taught was like, whether you call it direct or indirect, the nervous system experiences it the same and you treat it the same. So I always found that helpful to not have to worry too much about which one is this. If someone's showing up with that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, then we just treat it like that. I think, and someone's going to listen, be able to know for sure, but I think when you are witnessing it, it's vicarious trauma, either through story or seeing an event, experiencing it like your own life, feeling in danger, that moment of, possible death is when it's direct, I think.
And so the people most at risk, I imagine, of developing vicarious trauma are those, like you said, EMS who show up to these scenes all the time, or therapists who are talking with people who are experiencing trauma and work in a place where, maybe domestic abuse situations, if that's their specialty, that's the people that they're speaking to over and over. And that might be one of the
Yeah.
reasons why, right?
Yeah, exactly. And some of the hidden ones I'll add in there is a lot of researchers can be at risk, especially because if they're doing research on trauma and they're hearing a lot of stories or reading a lot of stories, that's quite a lot of exposure. And sometimes being at that bit of distance means then you can't see the other side of it, like, oh, that person was okay in the end, or, see the hope. It's a lot of just only reading about the worst moments in someone's life. And so that's, can be a protective factor for therapists, is seeing the ways that people survived, being able to hold the hope with them. And something that I talk about too is like, and balancing that out. So you're not 6 clients of trauma 5 days a week. Anyone would get burnt out by that quickly.
I imagine so. And you also talk about different types of empathy where you're hearing somebody and their story. I can't remember the exact terminology that you use, but the difference between hearing it, empathizing with it, and understanding it from the perspective of an outsider. Oh, I see what it is you went through, or actually becoming, immersed in that experience such that you feel the same sensations yourself as the person who's describing it to you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this one up because it's been hugely helpful for a lot of the helpers that I work with, or just even people who have a sort of helping role in their community, is to know, yeah, that old model of put yourself in someone else's shoes to try to understand what they're feeling, can be damaging. It raises our risk of vicarious trauma and burnout. And people end up getting it wrong more of the time. Because if we're thinking, oh, if I was in this position, I wonder how I would be feeling, we're coming from our lens, our identities, our biases. Where if instead, what you were talking about there, if we can kind of step back and go, yeah, from my perspective over on my chair, I wonder what this other person's experience is like. And if we can't tell, like to just ask, right? Rather than having to actually put our nervous systems entwined with theirs. And so, yeah, often, when we're hearing difficult stories, that balance becomes to, can I be with the person who's talking? Can I, continue to care? That's a real strength to have that empathy while also being grounded in my own seat, while also feeling into my breath and my nervous system, which reminds me that although what I'm hearing is difficult, it is not my story. It is not happening to my body right now. And taking the time to let my body hear those messages.
Right. So for a long time, my wife's been having some medical issues as a result of menopause, and she describes the symptoms to me, and I cannot fully imagine them myself at all. And I feel like I haven't really been as empathetic as I could be because I can't actually imagine going through those things. But
That's
now
such a good example.
you're telling me I'm doing it right. Like that's what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
that I'm doing exactly the right thing because I'm not actually feeling hot flashes and all the things, right?
Yeah, exactly. I love that example. It's such a perfect, encapsulation of what we're talking about here. But to take that step back and go like, oh yeah, what are you feeling? Like, tell me about that. Sometimes that alone is so helpful for the people in our lives to try to give voice to their experience. And then I often follow up with, okay, and what do you need? What can I do? It's not going to be, I relate to it. I get what you're going through exactly. It's okay. Maybe I'll bring you some water. I'm going to turn down the heat, right? There are lots of other ways that we can help without having to have experienced it directly.
Yes, I will get a second job so we can afford the air conditioning. That's So we have just a couple of minutes left. I'm hoping that we can close with this, which is, a lot of the time we think about boundaries as something we set for ourselves, but you were talking about it being a collaborative sort of thing. How does one go about helping someone else
Ooh.
figure out their boundaries?
Yeah. In relationships, that's an interesting one because I think what we can take responsibility is checking in with the other person. Even as simple as like, hey, what are we going to do this weekend? What do you want to do? Well, it doesn't matter to me. Right. So then I think our second responsibility is just to double check. Hey, I know you're the type of person who might just go along with what everyone else wants, but you've been working on boundaries and listening to your needs. Are you sure there isn't anything that you'd like to do this weekend? And if they're like, no, I'm really good, then trusting people to tell us what they need when they're ready to tell us, and that we can just do our part in it.
That sounds terrific. Nicole Perry, thank you so much for joining me. Tell everyone the title of your book and where they can get it.
It is The Boundaried Therapist. It's available on Amazon chapters, local bookstores, published by Brush Education.
The Boundaried Therapist, Sustaining Yourself in the Counseling Profession. A link to the book, as well as to Nicole's website and Instagram page, are available in the show notes. Thanks to Nicole for taking the time to speak with me today, and to you for listening, streaming, downloading, or reviewing today's episode. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.